Go. All right. Welcome, everybody, to another monthly webinar on Agile topics here with Next Up Solutions. We'll start off with some intros in case we have not met before. This is me. There is way too much stuff on this slide, but don't worry, it bears basically not at all on what we're going to talk about today. I am Dr. Patrick McConnell. You can call me Mac because my PhD is irrelevant to everything we're going to talk about today, so don't worry about it. I've been an Agilist for what goes for a pretty long time in this business, about 15 years at this point, starting off as a product owner and then becoming a Scrum Master and then stepping into full-time Agile coaching for a bunch of years, along the way becoming the director of the first Agile Center of Excellence at one of the government-focused system integrator companies in the DC area, and becoming a certified Scrum trainer, which is largely what I do most of the time these days. Teach people classes about Agile topics, mostly Scrum. And then I also still get to do some coaching and things like that. And as for Next Up Solutions, we're actually two entities under the same umbrella. We are Acceleration and Next Up Solutions. Acceleration is our software development practice, where what we do is build world-class, amazing software solutions for all sorts of organizations, operating in kind of an interesting model. What we do is we hire college students as they are finishing up degrees in things like computer science. They then come to work for us in between their classes, doing real software development and real testing, but under the guidance of our expert mentors who teach them that craft and keep them from blowing anything up. The companies that hire us get amazing work done at great rates. The students get a fantastic experience, which often lets them go off to great careers after they graduate, sometimes at the same companies that they were working for us at. So that's what we do at Acceleration. We're very proud of the way that works. If you have any needs or questions about it, please reach out. I will connect you to folks who will tell you all about what they do there. As for Next Up Solutions, we are a certified Agile training provider operating out of the DC area. We run all sorts of live taught, expert-led, engaging and games-based certified Agile classes. Lots of Scrum Alliance courses, also Kanban University, sometimes some IC Agile stuff, and then of course a full range of customized offerings to fit a particular institution's specific needs. And we are a full service Agile coaching and collaboration partner. So we do everything from helping new Agile teams get up and running, to helping existing teams get better, to helping whole enterprises plan out or improve their Agile transformation at scale. And then the third leg of that practice is helping bosses grow into Agile leaders. And as some of you may already know, the ability of leadership to embody an Agile mindset is often a limiting factor in terms of how much value we get out of Agile teams. So that's a very important part of what we do at Next Up as well. And if you have any needs in any of those areas, again, please reach out and I would be happy to chat with you about it and see how we can help you. All right, so that is us. What we're going to talk about today is a framework for launching Agile teams. Now, originally this talk was going to be given by someone else, so I kind of adapted it a little bit, but we're still basically going to hit the notes that was in the invite, so no false advertising, I promise. And what we're going to walk through here today is at a very high level, basically kind of a four-prong approach for starting up a new Agile team. So we're going to talk about some techniques we might do up front to frame out vision. Why are we doing the thing, whatever it is? Who are we doing it for? What is our goal in doing it? We'll talk about establishing the team itself, so learning who we are and how we're going to work together to accomplish that vision. We'll talk about getting a first kind of a quick start to our overall product backlog or service backlog, depending on how we're organized. And we'll talk about how we're going to institute our particular inspect and adapt patterns so that we can improve the way we're accomplishing that vision and the way we are a team. So yes, we basically need to start all four of those things at the same time. Luckily, we can make a jump on that pretty quickly, maybe in a day or two, kind of a off-site or something along those lines. We could get a new team up and running on all four of these areas. So let's go ahead and dive in. Let's start by talking about thinking about vision. So how are we going to frame out vision? Now, when we talk about vision here, we're not talking about months and months and months of analysis to nail down every single font and button color of what it is we're going to build. What we're really trying to do here is think about product vision in an Agile sense. which is a very tactical thing. The point of vision for us really is a tool that helps us all the time distinguish choices between right track and wrong track. Do they seem like they're helping us get towards our vision, towards our goals? Do they seem like they're distracting away from it? There are tons and tons of exercises that we might try for this. My favorite two are the 10-card product vision deck and the lean startup canvas. You can read more about 10-card product vision deck in a book called The Agile Samurai by Jonathan Rasmussen, which is a fun, quick read. It's really two sets of exercises, the big picture deck and the make it real deck. The point of the big picture deck is once we walk through all 5 of those exercises, and that might take, I don't know, maybe a morning or less with a team, we should have a pretty clear idea of what is it that we are trying to accomplish and why are we the right people to do it? Why do we think that we might be successful? Which should tell us, is this an idea worth pursuing, and get some buy-in? We can include our stakeholders in that exercise, things like that. And then we would proceed to the second set of 5 exercises, the make it real deck. And this is all about what might we need to understand to get to day 1. What is between us and actually day 1 of sprint 1, assuming we're going to be a Scrum team. So those are the 10-card product vision deck exercises. And the first set are really focused on kind of distinguishing right track versus wrong track. The second set are more about kind of the realities of the work, our own position in the institution, initial risk registers, things like that. So I like 10-card product vision deck a lot. A similar set of exercises would be the lean startup canvas, which is what you see here. The idea behind lean startup canvas, again, it's similar. It's a set of conversations that help us narrow in on what are we really trying to accomplish. There's a fair amount of overlap here between LSC, lean startup canvas, and the 10-card product vision deck. I wouldn't necessarily do both. One or the other is probably fine. But the idea is it's a set of 9 conversations for lean startup canvas. Most people recommend proceeding through them in the number order that you see on the screen. So starting with problem, then going to customer segments, then thinking about unique value proposition, and so on. Granted, if you're looking at that and you want to go through it in a different order, I don't think anybody's going to, take away your birthday for it. That's probably also fine. It's just the order you see on the screen is typically the way most people go through it. Whether you're using this approach or 10-card product vision deck, our overall goal here is to make sure that both people inside the team and our direct stakeholders and the people we're going to be talking to have the same understanding of what it is we're trying to accomplish. We all agree on the why. We all understand who we're doing the why for. We all have an understanding of core questions like, what does value mean? Things like that. So once we've got that core agreement up front about vision, sorry, I'm getting a little feedback from somebody. So if you're not on mute, please mute yourself. Yeah, I think we got that. All right. Once we've got that, we can start wading into more of the specifics. So for example, if we sketch out our problem statement in a lean startup canvas, that would be, what is the problem we're trying to solve for who? Now we might want to spend some more time thinking about the who. Who in particular are the customers or the users that we're serving? How are we going to reach out to them? How are we going to communicate with them? And we might want to organize our thinking about them into some kind of tool like a persona, which is an abstract hypothetical person that encapsulates some core segment that we need to understand. And we can fill in all the details for that persona we might want, give them a name, give them a picture, think about their role in an organization, what kind of job do they have, what kind of goals do they have in that job. And then we might want to think more about them, like who are they outside of work and what are they trying to achieve in life and what is their home life like, all those kind of things. The goal here is by the end, we've filled in enough detail that this is a real person. That's the idea, to us anyway. And then from that point on, it just becomes a shorthand. Anytime we're talking about doing a thing for a particular segment of users, we don't have to remind ourselves, remember, because this is for a person who's probably around the age of 34 and live in this part of the country and they're trying to do this in their job. We can just say, remember, this is for our Bob persona. as opposed to this other thing that we're building for our Sri persona or our Kali persona, or whatever it is, because those little names encapsulate so much thinking about these people as if they are real that all of those details just get bundled up just in that shorthand. So that's really useful. That also becomes, by the way, a way that we can share an understanding of our user segments around the organization if the work is going on that's bigger than a single team. Because if we're all sharing the same personas, that helps us think about these people. Thinking about personas also is going to become useful later when we talk about trying to sketch out our initial backlog. So we'll revisit this concept a little bit. But all right, so we've got some idea of the why and a little bit of the what up front. Now we thought about the who. The next step in upfront visioning that I would want to accomplish right away is thinking about the because. We understand who our users or who our customers are going to be. What is their problem that we want to solve for them? We also probably need to get some clarity around what's in it for us. And by that, I mean, what is the value that we're trying to deliver in this work? Is it something as straightforward as profit? I mean, often if we are in a for-profit company building a product, it's usually some kind of revenue goal ultimately. Like we're building a thing that we are going to sell, and then we will realize value in the form of dollars that people are going to give us for it or whatever. But revenue isn't always the value that we're trying to deliver. Certainly, most of my own experience is working in the public sector, meaning government work, which means we are often not selling a thing. We're building a thing because it's an inherent public good, or because we're required to by law, or whatever it is. There's no profit motive. So instead, the value we're trying to deliver might be things like the removal of risk from an existing structure, like making a system safer and more stable. Or it might be enabling learning. So standing up new and more data to the public so that people can do research and answer important questions, or so that internal decision makers can get information that answers their questions, things like that. Who knows? Whatever the value we're trying to deliver, and the things that you see on the slide at the moment, it's not an exhaustive list. Those are just common formal definitions of value that you might be interested in as well. But the idea is we should make that explicit. We should identify our stakeholders, we should talk to them, and we should get them to agree. What are the forms of value that this team is supposed to be delivering? Is it new revenue and also cost savings and also expanded market share? Great. Now, granted, often we do have, as I just said, more than one that form of value operating at the same time. That's okay. It just makes things more complicated, but still, we should get everybody involved to have the same understanding. The reason it's so important to get that buy-in, to build that consensus within the team and with our stakeholders around the forms of value we're trying to deliver, is that otherwise we lose kind of the plot of why we are a team in the first place, and we start to think of ourselves just as a feature factory, which means, oh, our goal is just to do more stuff. That's not it. The stuff, the widgets, the features, the product, whatever it is that we're building, that's a means to an end. The end is value. So if we have the same understanding of value, that helps sharpen all of our day-to-day decisions as well. Anytime we hit an unknown, oh, should we make it work like this or like that? I don't know. Which one of those seems like it's better serving the goal of increasing adoption, because that's the form of value we're supposed to be serving. So we have that conversation up front, and then we should also, while we're doing that, survey kind of the landscape of stakeholders we have. And spell those out, write their names down, understand things like who are they and how are we going to talk to them, and more importantly, which forms of value matter most to them. Because as I just said a second ago, when we have multiple forms of value operating at the same time with the team, it makes things more complicated. The way it makes things more complicated is sometimes we're going to be, forced to make a choice between something that serves one form of value, but not the other, and another idea that serves the other form of value, but not the first one. Which one do we pick? Well, it might depend on which one matters most to the stakeholder that we have to listen to more. So surveying that landscape can be really useful. And as a brand new team, we might even want to formalize a bit of that understanding with something like stakeholder mapping, which would mean writing down the names of stakeholders and trying to assess kind of them roughly into a 2x2 grid in terms of how much power do they have compared to us? Do we have to listen to what they say? Higher power. Or do they have to live with our choices? Lower power than us. Versus how much interest do they have? Are they super invested in the outcome of our work? High interest. Could they kind of take or leave it? Low interest. So we map our stakeholders out into this grid, and then that can become a template up front for us to think about how we need to relate to each of these folks. So for example, our high power, high interest folks, those are our promoters. Those are people we're going to have to listen to very closely. We're going to have to talk to them all the time. We're going to have to very carefully manage their expectations and their understanding of how we're making choices as a team. Otherwise, we aren't going to be allowed to be a team very much longer. On the flip side, if we do a good job of that, they're called promoters because they're out there in the space actively blocking and tackling for our needs. If we need help, we can always call on them because they need us to win. If we look good, they look good. And they're also telling everybody how cool the thing that we're building is, and they're looking for more resources, all these kind of things for us. Contrast that with, say, our defenders. These are folks who are also high power compared to us in the organization, but less interest in what we're doing. So I don't need to spend as much time or energy on them. What I need to do is maybe talk to them once or twice just to figure out, do they have some particular small pet interest in our work? If so, let's get that in the backlog. Let's check off that interest as quickly as we can, because once we've satisfied them, they're going to leave us alone. We don't have to spend much more time thinking about them. But as long as we satisfied them, later, if somebody is interfering with our vision for how we're going to deliver value, we might be able to call on defenders to stick up for us, to exert influence on our behalf, if we can connect the threat to us to a threat to whatever their particular pet interest was. So that technique is called stakeholder mapping, and you can find more info on that, or it's a thing that I talk about in my advanced CSM and advanced CSBO classes as well. But moving on from there, that should be enough really in, let's say, overall, probably a morning that a new team could do to get a real grounding in terms of what are we trying to accomplish here? Why are we doing it? What is the value for users? What is the value for us? Who is it that we need to make happy in our org? And strategizing a little bit in terms of how we want to think to them, or how we want to talk to them, excuse me. So that's our first pillar, framing out initial product vision. Next, we want to spend some time framing out questions of how we want to be a team. So who are the people involved and how do we want to do the work? The thing is, Agile teams, whether we're talking about Scrum or Kanban or whatever Agile framework, they are self-managing. They are self-organizing teams. That means that they own all aspects of the question, how the work will get done and who will do which parts of it and all those kind of things. That means that there's a certain amount of them having to figure out how to be a team at the very front. And there are a bunch of different models out there in the world of team formation. The one you see on front of you right now is called the Tuckman model, which you've probably also heard to referred as the forming, storming, norming, performing model. There is, in fact, a fifth stage, adjourning, which would be when the team ceases to be a team and how that process happens. But most of the time, we're just talking about the first 4 steps. The notion of this model is the forming stage is typically pretty quick. Hi, my name is, your name is. We talk about the team working agreement stuff. Then there's some period of storming, which is figuring out really all the day-to-day questions of how we're going to engage with each other and arguing about rules and deciding we need new additional rules and all those kind of things. Really all of the kind of hammering out, how are we in fact going to get along and work together to achieve goals? So that lasts some amount of time, and then we enter a norming phase where most of that kind of Sturm and Drang has died down, and now we figured out the basics, and we can just be a team. We can just show up, do the work. We figured all of that stuff out, and we're making small experimental adaptations, iteration by iteration, to get better at being a team until we reach a point of very high performance, and that would be the performing stage. Our goal up front with a brand new team is to help them get through the forming step as quickly as possible and give them a good foundation to negotiate the storming phase. That's really where we want to be. So some things we can do early on, day one or day two, with this group to help with those things would be a few techniques like establishing a team trust canvas. So this is a team spelling out, our understanding of what we're trying to achieve, how we're going to relate to leadership around us, how we might relate to other teams, how we're going to talk to each other, how are we going to be evaluated, how are we going to know whether or not we're succeeding or failing, all those kind of things. The example you see there on the screen comes from Alexei Kulev. You don't have to use exactly these boxes, but it's a way of a team and their leadership to spell out a number of details about the organization's understanding of the kind of boundaries and goals of this team versus the team's understanding of how they're going to exist in this organization, things like that. We're also going to need to decide what method of being a team are we going to use. And most commonly, if we're talking about Agile teams, we're either talking about Scrum teams, which is far and away the most commonly used Agile framework, or we're talking about Kanban, one or the other. As far as which framework the team should use, maybe that choice has already been made for them. And if so, hopefully it's one that makes sense. If not, though, they're going to have to pick that for themselves. And there are some core differences between the frameworks. We won't get too far into the weeds of that. But just at a high level, if we're thinking about the kinds of work in front of the team, and we could separate that work on two dimensions, what and how, what has to do with how perfectly can we know in advance what the work is going to be? How much control do we have over plans and strategy? At 100% on what, we can come up with our single best plan and we'll never have to change it. At 0% on what, we have no control over the future. Stuff just comes at us and we just have to be ready to react and deal with it, but we don't get to direct it. We just have to respond. So that's the what dimension. The how dimension, on the other hand, is once we know what the thing we need to do next is, how perfectly could we know in advance the single best way to do that thing anytime we have to do it? At 100% on how, anytime we're given a request, we could go to the bookshelf and pull off the standard operating procedure for that thing, follow those 12 steps. It'll always exactly work. At 0% on how, everything we're given is new in a new way. It's going to take figuring out to get it done, and that learning won't apply to the next thing because the next thing will be new in totally different ways. So that's the how dimension. Down in the lower left corner are circumstances of very high chaos, like pure science or pure research and development. And I'm not usually trying to use Agile approaches down there because the work is so chaotic, we can't have any plans at all, let alone even short-term ones. In the opposite corner are circumstances of such high order that I don't need Agile approaches because the work is so determinative and well understood that I don't need the ability to adjust. So pure factory work, for example, where we can just be pure lean, maybe. And all Agile approaches are rooted in lean thinking. Agile and lean go really well together, but there are circumstances where lean makes sense and agility doesn't. And a factory context might be one of those. In between those two gray areas, though, are the spaces, in between those two extremes, are the gray areas where Agile approaches often make the most sense. And not every approach is suitable for every circumstance. There are times when Scrum might not be a good idea, but Kanban really would. Times, for example, where some of the work is plannable, but others is entirely reactive. That means it's going to be really hard to plan a sprint, which is an assumption of Scrum. But Kanban teams don't plan sprints. They just work in a continuous flow fashion, a few things at a time. So dealing with unplanned some of their work is less of a big deal for them. Scrum tends to be a good fit for stuff in the middle, work that is inherently elaborative, inherently creative. It's always a little new, building off of stuff we've done in the past. And we want the rhythm of fixed sprints, of that routine cadence. as a regular inflection point to take a look at, are we getting towards our goal or not? Software development tends to be a good fit for Scrum. That's not surprising because that's the domain that Scrum came out of in the first place. Software can also work perfectly well with Kanban as well. Other circumstances, like if you're a help desk, that's probably a better fit for Kanban. And there's lots of other creative work outside of tech that's a really good fit for Scrum, even though it has nothing necessarily to do with software. Graphic design, for example. Certain types of structured research, like legal or market research, can be a good fit for Scrum. So that's a little bit of a high-level guide in terms of thinking about which kind of organizing principles do we want to use, what framework, Scrum or a continuous flow pattern, like say Kanban. Next up, we need the people in the team to start understanding who are they, and there are lots of techniques for this. One of my favorites would be something like an internal job fair, or sometimes that's also called a skill market, where everybody on the team individually spends, I don't know, 15, 20 minutes putting together this kind of advertising poster for them that spells out their name and how they want people to address them. And then we might talk about skills. Here are the things I can do. Also, here are the things I can do really well and I can teach other people. Here's the kind of work I really love to do. So anytime there's an opportunity for that, that's the kind of thing I really want to dig in on first. Here are some skills that I want to learn, and they might write those things down. And then also, because we need to understand each other as people, they might include things like, what am I outside of work? You know, what kind of family situation do I have? Do I have pets? What are my hobbies? What kind of, I don't know, cuisines do I like? Or who knows, whatever it is, just maybe even some silly things, just to start seeing each other as human beings. And everyone would build their poster, and then we would spend some time walking around from one to the other, and people would present. We would start to make connections. We would start to chime in and see each other. That would be really interesting. So I've done that a few times with teams. I find it's a really good way to not just ice break, right, but actually start to dig in on how are we going to plug into this team? What are we going to see as people's kind of primary roles, but also how are they going to branch out into cross-functionality? This is also a way for us to start identifying, do we feel like we have skill gaps on the team? Is there something missing in terms of a capability right now today that we know we need? How are we going to address that? And then from here, once we start to understand each other as people, we might dig in on something like a team working agreement. If you've never used one of those before, it's really just a list of behavioral rules that an Agile team agrees to with themselves about how they want to be a team. They can include basically anything that we as a team want to be in there. Some example elements of a team working agreement might include something like, if we're a Scrum team, what kind of cadence are we going to have? 2 weeks, 3 weeks? What day of the week do we want sprint planning to be on? What time of day do we want to do our daily scrums? Things like that. If we want to establish a definition of done, we should probably start that in our team working agreement. That might be refined over time. It might evolve, but still, we want an initial idea of it. What kind of communication channels do people want? Are we going to be using Slack and Zoom? Are we going to be working together in a non-meeting context, for example, to get back to the notion of sitting next to each other in cubes if we're a virtual team, or whatever it is? Or are we actually co-located? Do we have some shared space together? And if not, how are we going to get together to do planning and things along those lines? We might include notions like, do we want to use pairing or mobbing practices to do the work? How are we going to deal with distractions that pop up, both in the middle of an iteration if we're a Scrum team, or even just during a particular task, whatever kind of team we are? What tools and what information radiator practices do we want? How are we going to organize knowledge in the team? How are we going to share awareness of what work is happening and who's doing what in the team? Things like that. If we have a product backlog, how are we going to visualize that? If we're doing sprints, how are we going to make our sprint backlog seeable as well? And then any other kind of organizing principles we might need as a group. Not an exhaustive list. Again, you could have a bunch of other things in this as well. That's just some example elements we might want to think about in our team working agreement. As we're establishing those, we're also going to start to need some mechanics to make decisions as a group. Lots of techniques for that, but a few that I use all the time would be these: decider protocol and fist of five, which you may have seen before. In decider protocol, what we do is we ask everybody, every time there's a decision, all right, let's vote. Everybody, thumbs up, thumbs sideways, or thumbs down. Thumbs up is I agree. Thumbs sideways is I don't exactly agree, but I'm okay if this is the choice. And thumbs down is I don't agree. And we might make it like a threshold for decisions. So if everybody's thumbs up or thumbs sideways, the decision carries. If anybody's thumbs down, it doesn't carry. We're going to talk about it again and maybe adjust the choice and then vote again until everybody is thumbs up or thumbs sideways. Fist of five is a similar kind of idea, except instead of thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever, it's some number of fingers, 0 through 5. And a similar kind of threshold might be established. If everybody's a 4 or a 5, it wins. If anybody's less than that, we'll talk about it and vote again. If we're, instead of a yes-no kind of choice, evaluating a bunch of options, we might try something like dot voting, where everybody in the group gets a certain number of votes to cast, like dot stickers. And then people bring up and put their dots on whichever choices they want. They can cast all of their dots for the same option, or they could split them across a number of options until they run out of votes. And the top choice or the top several choices with the most votes wins. So all of those are very common collaborative decision-making tools. You can also support them by bolting on wideband Delphi mechanisms as well. Wideband Delphi is a fancy term for any method of making a choice where the first round, at least, of the deciding is anonymous. So, for example, if we're doing decider protocol and everyone's in a room together, we ask everybody to close their eyes while they vote. And only the facilitator at the front of the room is seeing the votes. The advantage of a wideband Delphi approach, like planning poker or everybody closing their eyes, or people entering the room to vote with stickers one at a time, or whatever it is. The advantage of that is the anonymity, hopefully, helps people give their honest opinion or vote whichever way they feel strongly about without inadvertently norming their answer against what they think other people are going to do. So I strongly recommend wideband Delphi techniques, especially for new teams, especially for things like estimating, if we're doing estimating, things like that. So, bunch of considerations there for how we're going to be a team, how we're going to get to know each other, things like that. Now we can move on to pillar number 3, framing out our initial backlog. Whether we're a Scrum team or a Kanban team or something else, we need to start getting from high-level vision down to, okay, but what are we actually going to do? What are we actually going to build? And there are a lot of techniques we might use for this. Something to bear in mind is that a general idea about Agile delivery, whether it's Scrum or Kanban, is the notion that we kind of have this S-curve for customer value. Up front, what we're really doing is validating some core assumptions, we're answering questions, we're proving out ideas like, is this product even a thing? Do people even want this? And we do that as quickly as we can so we can get to a point of start building stuff that we think people want. And then we're improving vision empirically after that based on feedback so that we can deliver the most value as quickly as we can. And then at some point, we kind of hit this break point where we're doing more and more stuff for less and less of a return. And at that point, the questions we're answering are more along the lines of, should we even still be doing this? At the very front of this curve, a lot of what we're doing is answering key questions of, is this possible? Do people want this? Are we allowed to do this? Can we do this in a way that's worth doing? So we're structuring maybe our initial loops through what we would call the product discovery cycle around core MVP questions. An MVP, or minimum viable product, is a term that gets abused a whole lot. But for now, what you can think of it is, it's a bundle of features. It's a bundle of answered questions that get us to a point where we can put something in front of our intended users or stakeholders and ask them, hey, have we solved your problem yet? And if they say no, then we add a few more things, and then we ask again, and we do that again and again and again until we finally discover MMP, the minimal marketable product, which is this empirically derived smallest set of stuff that people actually need to meet our goal. Every time we go through one of those little MVP loops, we're really doing this product discovery cycle where we're identifying some things that we want to validate or build. We build those things, we answer those questions, we validate that we did it right, and then we get feedback on it. The thing to bear in mind as we're thinking about sketching out our initial product backlog is we are more concerned with outcome than we are with output. Output is the stuff that the team is building. Outcome is the impact we want it to have on the world. Our goal as an Agile team is the most outcome for the least output. But it's easy to get lost in output. It's easy to get lost and think of teams just as feature factories. And the backlog just becomes a list of stuff. It's not value anymore. It's just stuff. Oops. So we want to head that off at the very beginning by thinking about everything that we do as being a part of this greater goal or set of goals related to value, whatever that is. One tool we might use to do that right off the bat would be something like an impact map, where what we're doing is, okay, we have this far off goal, like we want to grow our mobile advertising business. We want to sell more ads in the app that we're building or something like that. We would identify each of the personas or actors that we need to influence to meet that goal. So for example, for this, the example you see on the screen is about a mobile advertising business. So they need the super fans using their app to come back to the app more often. They need those fans to stay longer each time they open the app. They need them to see more ads while they're there. And each of those impacts might map to specific ideas that become some of the first items in our backlog. Oh, maybe we need the ability to do push updates. Maybe we need special offers. Maybe if we stand up forums, people will be interacting with each other, which means they're looking at the app while they're reading and typing. That's more opportunity to show them ads, whatever it is. So the things all the way at the right, the backlog items and ideas, those are maybe the first things that go in our product backlog, our initial ideas. But notice that they're rooted all the way to the thing on the left, all the way to some understanding of how ultimately those impacts influence people and result in value. That understanding is really important for us to build out and preserve. So that's where some of our very first backlog items might come from. It's kind of the middle ground here between vision and actual things that a team might do in a sprint, let's say. Another source of early backlog items might be core assumptions. And a technique we might use to identify some of those would be assumption mapping. Here, what we're going to do is identify what are the core questions in terms of desirability, feasibility, and viability. Desirability would be, we think we're solving a problem for some subset of people. We should go validate that they in fact want us to solve that problem. Those are desirability assumptions. Feasibility assumptions have to do with, do we have the ability and know-how to make this work? And viability is there anything actually in it for us? Was this going to result in the value that we think it's going to? Is there a business model here that works for us? So when we talk about assumption mapping, what we would do is brainstorm out as many of these assumptions as we can. We might involve our core stakeholders, like our promoters especially, in this discussion. And then we would map them out in terms of how important versus unimportant to us is this. Does this particular assumption have to break a particular way or else there's no point in doing this work? That's a very important assumption. If it doesn't break our way, would that maybe just result in a minor change to our plan? Maybe that's on the less important side of things. And we would look at, is it known or unknown? Do we already have the information to answer that question? That's known. Unknown is we don't even have the info yet. We have to create it. We have to find it. We have to run tests. We have to solicit surveys. We have to, who knows? So that at a very high level is assumption mapping. So you map out your assumptions, and then the things in the upper right quadrant, your important unknowns, those also go into your product backlog as questions that we want to answer as quickly as we can. All right, so I've said this phrase, product backlog, a bunch of times. In terms of the stuff that's in that list, it's really any potential piece of work that the team might need to do to realize the vision of whatever this product is going to be. If we think about something like building a new piece of software, a lot of those backlog items are going to be features, like capabilities that we want to exist, results that we hope will occur when someone flips a lever or something. There could, though, also be a bunch of other stuff in that product backlog too, like bugs that we discovered accidentally escaped production as we're building the thing, purely technical tasks, like standing up the development environment that we're going to use to do the work. And then most importantly, knowledge items, questions we need to answer that would enable us to do one of the other types of things. So all of those early assumptions that I was just talking about, those are examples of knowledge items. And we would put those in the backlog and we would try to answer them as quickly as we can, because if they don't break our way, well, then whoops, there's not much point to doing anything else that's in the product backlog. That's the idea. When we think about the very first backlog items that the team wants to do, we would also be refining them to a point where we feel like we understand the starting and finish line for this work. Do we think we could get that done inside of a sprint, for example, things like that. And an acronym to help us think about, is a backlog item refined enough, would be INVEST. This comes from a person named Bill Wake. I is for independent, meaning we can do them in any order. N is for negotiable, meaning how it gets done is going to be a discussion among the team, and then maybe also informed by whoever is asking for the thing. V is for valuable. We understand why we're doing it and how it serves the greater product goal or the objectives we're serving. E is for estimatable or estimable, meaning we can size it. We can tell that it's small enough to get done in let's say, a sprint, if we're a Scrum team. S also goes to the small there. And then finally, T would be for testable. We can prove that it works and that we're done with it. So we're thinking about forming out our initial backlog as a team now, the things we might work on up front in our very first day one sprint, if we're a Scrum team, let's say. We're also going to need to agree about how we're going to manage flow. How are we going to make sure that we're not biting off too much stuff at once? If we're a Scrum team, we're probably doing that with some form of relative estimating, like using the story point or complexity scale or the double scale or the t-shirt scale. Or maybe you like Alistair Coburn's scale, which comes from a framework called Crystal, which is Cherry Football 5 Camaro Mammoth. You know, whatever scale we use doesn't really matter. What matters is that as a team, we can kind of agree on what it means. And then we can start using it to plan realistic sprints. If we're not a Scrum team, if we're a Kanban team, instead we're working in continuous flow fashion, what we're going to do is map out our flow from starting a thing to getting it done, and we're going to limit work in progress at each one of those steps. And then how do we set those initial work in progress limits? Well, we're going to guess. Usually it starts with a decision about how many people work in each of those columns. So if only one person can do deployments, we shouldn't have a work in progress limit of bigger than one, because that person can really only be doing one thing at a time. Obviously, we could say a lot more about that topic, but still at a high level, that's kind of how Scrum teams and Kanban teams think about encouraging and promoting flow. Our goal is to value finishing over starting. That's the idea. All right, so there's a whole bunch of upfront kind of day one teaming considerations that I would want to think about. The last, or excuse me, the kind of last pillar here of the four that I talked about that we would work on would be thinking about framing out our inspect and adapt loops. So all Agile frameworks are what we would call empirically controlled processes. That means rather than thinking about defining all the work up front and then rigorously managing to that plan, we assume that we're going to need to adapt plans and methods along the way, and we want to do that all the time based on feedback. So every Agile framework has inspect and adapt loops baked in. That's really what empirical process control is. We are continually transparent around what it is we're trying to build. We regularly inspect how well we're doing it, and then we make adaptations. to get better at doing it. And we need to talk about how are the inspect and adapt loops for this particular team going to work. Now, if you're a Scrum team here, you have a little bit of a leg up because Scrum very explicitly comes with 3 different inspect and adapt loops baked into the framework. One around the current and future state of the product, one around their plan for their current sprint and how they're going to meet their sprint goal. And then the third one is about their process of being a Scrum team. So 3 different loops there. Each one gets looked at least once every single sprint, and that's very explicitly baked into the framework. Kanban teams, instead, Kanban doesn't come with those loops. Kanban teams have to decide them for themselves. So do we want some kind of product inspect and adapt loop? Yes, we do, but how's it going to work? How are we going to do product reviews? Who's going to attend them? How often? Do we want some kind of team retrospective behavior like Scrum teams use? Probably a good idea. How should it work? That's going to be up to us. So Kanban teams do have to decide those mechanics for themselves. Also, as a team, we probably want to get some agreement around what kind of metrics do we want to be looking at all the time. Neither Scrum nor Kanban come with a specific list of measures that we're supposed to be using. Instead, teams decide those for themselves. And my general rule of thumb is we should use measures that help us see the behaviors we want to see as a team, either to encourage them or discourage them. So, for example, if we are a software development team, I think it's a really good idea to have some metrics around software quality. Which ones, though, would depend entirely on what kind of work are we doing and how are we a team. All right. So that really is our 4 pillars there. We talked about framing out vision, we talked about framing out the team, we talked about framing out the backlog, and we talked about framing out our inspect and adapt loops. That, for me, would be the 4 pillars there. Before we move to questions, there was a comment in the chat about, Will says, I liked the wideband Delphi technique, but it tends to result in an in-depth debate, which takes a lot of time. How do we find the right balance between understanding the choices made and not wasting too much time on tech talk? I think it really depends on the topic. If we're talking about, let's say, estimating, the real point of a wideband Delphi approach, like, say, planning poker, where everyone throws in their first estimate anonymously, is just to see if we have huge gaps. You know, if everyone's pretty close to each other, it doesn't matter that much. But if some people think it's a huge thing and some people think it's a little thing, we definitely want to explore that and talk about why. If it feels like the conversation's getting really bogged down, we might look at facilitation techniques like tracking or signaling to talk about, do we feel like at this point it's worth continuing this conversation, or are we more or less in the weeds now? And the specific differences don't matter at this point because we've mostly hammered out the issue. And we could have people do thumbs up, thumbs down, for example. And we might even use a lean coffee approach where people are voting, do we want to spend 5 more minutes discussing this, or do we put a pin in it for now, for example. But thanks for that comment. Well, I appreciate that. All right, well, why don't we spend about 5 minutes here giving people time for questions. If you want to use the raise hand feature, I can call in folks one at a time. But yeah, questions or comments about what we just walked through. I know it was a lot of stuff, a relatively short period of time. Right. I will also give you a cheat code for establishing new Agile teams too, which is hire a coach. Bring in people who've done a lot of it. They will help you get through that faster. Typically takes a new Agile team, if we're talking about, say, a Scrum team, anywhere from 5 to 7 sprints typically to get through those forming and storing phases, but an experienced coach can help you get through that much quicker. Any other questions or comments? All right. Well then, thanks for coming, everybody. Very much appreciate your time and glad that you could be with us today. Here is my contact info, should you need it. If you've got Agile coaching questions, Agile career, Agile training questions, by all means, reach out. I have a very large network of Agilists all over the world on LinkedIn, so by all means, feel free to connect with me there as well. And also please consider giving Next Up a follow on all the socials, particularly LinkedIn. We post great blog articles once a month, plus generally these webinars once a month, great free ways to learn stuff and keep connected and build your skills. And if there's anything else that I or that Next Up Solutions or Acceleration can do for you in terms of Agile training, Agile coaching, software development services, we are here and we would love to help you. I will stick around here as we're closing out. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your Friday and have a great weekend, everybody. And we will see you next time.
Thank you, Mark.